The cracked linoleum of the kitchen floor seemed to breathe, a faint, irregular pulse beneath Arlo's bare feet. He traced the fissure with his toe, a spiderweb of grey against the faded yellow, and felt a prickle of something like recognition. It was the 21st, he knew, a Tuesday that felt steeped in the stale scent of old newspapers and something metallic like old pennies. His cat, Bartholomew, a creature of midnight fur and eyes like chips of amber, sat on the windowsill, a silent sentinel, his tail a slow, deliberate sweep against the glass. Arlo watched him, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. Bartholomew's gaze was fixed, not on the muted street outside, but on a point somewhere beyond the frosted pane, a place Arlo could, too, see. He tried to shake it off, the paranoia that clung to him like damp wool. It was just the usual, the shadows playing tricks, the house settling. But today, the settling felt different, more deliberate, as if something were meticulously arranging the creaks and groans. He'd been feeling it for weeks, this creeping sensation of being observed, of the very air thinning around him, charged with an unseen presence. He needed to get out, to walk, to feel the solid, indifferent pavement beneath his shoes. He pulled on a worn jacket, the fabric cool and slick against his skin, and the metallic tang in the air seemed to sharpen. Bartholomew let out a low, rumbling purr, a sound that usually soothed Arlo, but today it held a dissonant note, a vibration that felt less like contentment and more like a warning. As Arlo reached for the doorknob, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping from the living room. Full tap, tap, tap. Asterisk, it was too light to be a branch against the window, too regular to be the house. His heart hammered against his ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it wasn't his imagination. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and Arlo found himself backing away from the door, his eyes darting towards the hallway. The shadows there seemed to deepen, to coalesce, and he could almost make out shapes within them, shapes that writhed and shifted, like figures seen through a thick, misty veil. He gripped the worn wood of the doorframe, his knuckles white, the tapping now accompanied by a faint, dry rustling, as if of brittle paper being crinkled. He peered down the dim corridor, his breath catching in his throat. The tapping stopped, the rustling ceased. A profound silence descended, heavier than any sound, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. Bartholomew, who had been watching him with an unnerving stillness, suddenly hissed, arching his back, his fur bristling. Arlo's gaze snapped to the far end of the hallway, to the doorway of the spare room, a room he rarely used, filled with the forgotten detritus of past lives. And there, bathed in the weak, grey light filtering through the grimy window, he saw it. A doll, perched on the edge of an overturned crate. It wasn't one of his. Its porcelain face was cracked, one glassy eye staring blankly ahead, the other missing, leaving a dark, vacant socket. Its painted lips were a garish red, pulled into a smile that was less amusement and more a rictus of agony. It was dressed in a faded, lace-trimmed dress, the fabric yellowed and brittle, and its tiny, jointed hands, each finger tipped with a minuscule black nail, were clasped together, as if in prayer, or perhaps in anticipation. Arlo felt a cold dread, a sickening certainty that the doll had moved. Its head was tilted now, the vacant socket seeming to fix on him, and he knew, with the absolute horror of a man who has glimpsed the void, that he had been seen. The alchemist of his own despair, he was creating these visions, he told himself, but the doll's motionless stare promised a far more tangible, far more terrifying reality. The doll's gaze, or rather, the vacant socket where its eye should have been, felt like a physical weight. Arlo remained frozen, his senses on high alert, straining against the silence that had fallen like a shroud. He told himself it was just a doll, a forgotten relic of some previous tenant, its placement a coincidence. But the way its head was tilted, the almost imperceptible shift in its posture, spoke of something far more deliberate. He could feel the static electricity in the air, a prickling sensation that ran up his arms, raising the fine hairs on his neck. Bartholomew, no longer hissing, had flattened himself against the floor, a dark, silent shadow, his amber eyes wide and fixed on the doll. The cat's fear was a palpable thing, a cold wave washing over Arlo, amplifying his own. He wanted to run, to bolt from the apartment, to escape the suffocating stillness, but his feet felt rooted to the floorboards. The doll seemed to draw him in. Its chipped porcelain and faded dress a tableau of decay that held a morbid fascination. He imagined the unseen eye, somewhere in that dark hollow, watching, cataloguing his fear. He took a tentative step forward, the floorboard groaning beneath his weight, a sound that seemed to echo unnaturally in the confined space. The doll didn't react. Its painted smile remained fixed, a cruel, silent mockery. Arlo's mind, a fractured mirror reflecting 1,000 distorted images, latched onto the details. The tiny, delicate fingers, almost impossibly formed. The way the lace of its dress seemed to fray at the edges as if constantly disintegrating. He remembered a nightmare from his childhood, a recurring vision of a doll, faceless and silent, always just out of reach, always watching. This felt like that nightmare made manifest. The edges blurred, the fear intensified. He forced himself to breathe, slow, ragged inhales, trying to push back the rising tide of panic. He needed to confirm it. He needed to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it was just a doll, a figment of his own frayed nerves. He took another step, then another, his shadow stretching long and distorted before him. As he drew closer, a faint, cloying scent began to permeate the air, like overripe flowers mixed with something acrid and metallic. It was the smell of decay, he realized, a scent that clung to the doll like a shroud. He could see now that the cracks in its porcelain were not just superficial. They ran deep, revealing a dark, crumbling interior. The fabric of its dress was not merely faded but seemed to be actively rotting, shedding fine dust like particles with every imperceptible tremor of the air. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering inches from its cold, smooth cheek. He felt a faint vibration emanating from the doll, a low hum that seemed to resonate deep within his bones. Bartholomew let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of pure animal terror. Arlo's fingers brushed against the doll's cheek, and he recoiled as if burned. The porcelain was unnaturally cold, a chill that seeped into his fingertips, spreading through his arm, and then he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch of the doll's tiny, jointed fingers. It was still, of course, motionless from his vantage point, but the subtle shift, the infinitesimal movement was undeniable. The doll was not just a passive observer, it was alive. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending a tremor through his entire body. The tremor that ran through Arlo was not just a physical reaction. It was an earthquake of the mind, shattering the fragile scaffolding of his composure. The doll's fingers, he swore, had moved. A fraction of an inch, a mere suggestion of motion, but enough to confirm the gnawing dread that had been his constant companion. He snatched his hand back, the unnatural cold still clinging to his skin like frost. Bartholomew, sensing his master's terror, let out a choked yowl and scrambled backward, a streak of black fur vanishing into the relative safety of the kitchen. Arlo was alone again, facing the thing in the hallway, the thing that wore the mask of a child's toy. He could feel its presence now, a suffocating pressure, as if the very air had thickened, become viscous, and was pressing in on him from all sides. The painted smile seemed to widen, the cracked lips stretching into an impossible grin. He knew, with a certainty that curdled his stomach, that it was looking at him, that the empty socket held an awareness far older and more malevolent than any doll should possess. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving the doll. Each step was a monumental effort, his legs feeling like lead. The hallway seemed to stretch, to lengthen, the distance between him and the doll becoming an abyss. He stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe, the rough wood biting into his palm. He risked a glance back towards the kitchen, a desperate plea for Bartholomew's comforting presence. But the cat was nowhere to be seen, only the faint, unsettling sound of its terrified scrabbling disappearing into the depths of the apartment. He was truly alone. The metallic tang in the air intensified, mingling with the cloying sweetness of decay, creating a sickening perfume that coated the back of his throat. He could hear it now, a faint, papery rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a barren plain. It was coming from the doll, he knew, a sound that seemed to emanate from its very core, a whisper of something ancient and hungry. He imagined it unfurling, its brittle limbs extending, its vacant gaze fixing on him with an unblinking intensity. He turned and fled, not towards the kitchen, but towards the front door, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He fumbled with the lock, his fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. The rustling sound seemed to follow him, growing louder, closer, as if whatever was making it was now moving with an alarming speed. He risked a glance over his shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. The hallway was empty. The doll was gone. A wave of relief, sharp and sudden, washed over him, quickly followed by a fresh surge of terror. Where had it gone? The thought of it lurking, unseen, in the shadows of his own apartment was almost unbearable. He finally wrenched the lock open and burst out into the dim afternoon light, gasping for air, the oppressive stillness of the apartment replaced by the distant hum of traffic. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He just ran. The image of the doll's vacant socket and its impossible smile seared into his mind, a haunting reminder of the horrors that could lurk in the quiet corners of one's own home. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with a life of their own. Arlo kept running, his lungs burning, the pavement a blur beneath his worn sneakers. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to put distance between himself and that apartment, between himself and that doll. The metallic tang from the apartment still clung to him, a phantom scent that made him gag. He passed a shop window, catching his reflection. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wild, a stark contrast to the usual placid mask he wore. He looked like a man who had seen something he couldn't unsee, something that had clawed its way out of the dark recesses of his mind and into the harsh light of reality. He slowed his pace, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and leaned against a cold brick wall, trying to regain some semblance of control. The paranoia that had always been a low hum beneath the surface of his consciousness had now escalated into a deafening roar. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the images that flashed behind his eyelids. The doll's cracked face, the empty socket, the subtle, terrifying twitch of its fingers. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that it hadn't stayed in the hallway. It had moved. It had followed him, or perhaps it was already there, waiting, nestled amongst the familiar clutter of his living room, its painted smile a silent promise of torment. A profound sense of helplessness washed over him. He was trapped, not just by his own fractured psyche, but by something external, something that was beginning to exert its influence on the world around him. The very air seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, a subtle distortion that made the familiar streets feel alien and threatening. He felt a sudden, intense prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the familiar feeling of being watched. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was no one there, just the deepening twilight and the shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. He knew he had to go back. The thought sent a fresh wave of revulsion through him, but he also knew that running was futile. Whatever this was, it was tied to him, to his home. He couldn't escape it by simply running through the streets. He turned, his steps heavy, and began the long, agonizing walk back. As he neared his apartment building, a strange calmness settled over him, a dangerous, almost seductive resignation. The paranoia hadn't vanished, it had simply morphed into a cold, detached acceptance. He reached his building, the familiar drab facade offering no comfort. He pushed open the heavy front door and stepped into the dim, echoing lobby. The air inside was thick and cloying, the metallic scent stronger than ever. He ascended the stairs, each creak of the worn wood sounding like a taunt. He reached his door, and for a moment he hesitated. He could hear it, even through the thick wood, faint rhythmic tapping. Tapping, tap, tap, tap. It was back! And this time it sounded louder, more insistent, as if it knew he had returned. The tapping was louder now, no longer a subtle suggestion, but a percussive insistence, a tiny hammer against the silence of his apartment. Arlo's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, the cold metal burning against his skin. He pushed the door open, a sliver of light spilling into the dim hallway, and stepped inside. The cloying scent, a mixture of decay and something acrid, was overwhelming, clinging to the back of his throat like a physical presence. Bartholomew was nowhere to be seen, a ghost in his own home. The tapping continued, a monotonous rhythm that seemed to resonate in Arlo's very bones. It was coming from the living room, the room where the shadows always seemed to gather, where the air felt perpetually colder. He forced himself forward, his eyes scanning the familiar, yet now alien landscape of his apartment. Every object seemed to hold a hidden menace, every shadow a lurking threat. He felt as if he were moving through a dream, a nightmare of his own making, where reality itself had become pliable and treacherous. He reached the threshold of the living room, his breath catching in his throat. The tapping stopped. The silence that descended was more terrifying than any sound, a heavy, expectant hush. And then he saw it. Perched on the edge of his worn armchair, its tiny porcelain face turned directly towards him, sat the doll. It was no longer in the hallway. It had moved, with an impossible, silent grace. Its cracked features seemed to mock him, the painted smile a rictus of pure malice. The empty socket where its eye should have been seemed to bore into him, a void that promised an unending darkness. Arlo's mind reeled. This was not a hallucination. This was real. The doll was here in his apartment, watching him, waiting. He could feel the heat radiating from its small porcelain body, a perverse warmth that spoke of an unnatural life. He imagined its brittle fingers, so delicately formed, reaching out, grasping, pulling him into its own silent, terrifying world. A low growl rumbled from somewhere behind him, and Arlo spun around, his heart a frantic bird against his ribs. Bartholomew stood in the doorway, his fur bristled, his amber eyes wide with a primal fear. He was cornered, trapped between Arlo and the doll, his usual bravado replaced by a desperate animal terror. Arlo watched as Bartholomew's gaze flickered from him to the doll, his body tensing as if preparing to flee, but there was nowhere for him to go. The doll, with its vacant stare and painted smile, had drawn a line, a boundary that neither man nor beast could cross. Arlo felt a surge of protective instinct, a desperate urge to shield his cat from this encroaching horror. He stepped forward, placing himself between Bartholomew and the doll, his own fear momentarily overshadowed by a fierce protective rage. He would not let this thing harm his cat. He would not let it break him further. He met the doll's empty gaze, his own eyes blazing with a defiance born of desperation, and whispered, "Get out." The silence that followed Arlo's desperate plea was more potent than any scream. It stretched, taut and vibrating, a palpable entity in the room. The doll remained motionless, its painted smile unwavering, its vacant socket fixed on Arlo. He could feel its awareness, a cold, alien intelligence that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the room, chilling the air and thickening the shadows. Bartholomew, pressed against Arlo's legs, let out a low, mournful whine, his body trembling. Arlo tightened his grip on the cat, a futile attempt to offer comfort, to offer protection when he himself felt utterly exposed. The metallic scent seemed to intensify, the acrid undertones becoming sharper, more aggressive, as if the very air was beginning to corrode. He imagined the doll's brittle fingers twitching again, a silent signal that only he and Bartholomew could perceive. Then a sound, not a tap, not a rustle, but a soft, dry scraping, like a nail being dragged across rough wood. It came from the doll, a faint, almost inaudible noise that sent a fresh wave of terror through Arlo. He watched, mesmerized, as the doll's right hand, so delicately jointed, slowly, deliberately, began to move. The tiny fingers curled inward one by one, the brittle porcelain clicking softly with each movement. It was a slow, agonizing unfolding, a grotesque imitation of life that was far more horrifying than any overt attack. Bartholomew let out a sharp hiss, a sound of pure, unadulterated fear, and tried to pull away, but Arlo held him tight. He couldn't let go. He couldn't let the cat escape into the unknown dangers of the apartment. The doll's hand continued its slow, deliberate motion, each movement a testament to an unnatural, malevolent will. Arlo's mind raced, his fractured thoughts a chaotic whirl of fear and disbelief. This wasn't just a doll. It was an instrument, a conduit for something far darker, something that had found its way into his life and was now slowly, inexorably tightening its grip. He could feel his own sanity fraying, the edges of his perception blurring. Was the doll moving, or was it the room itself that was shifting, contorting around him? The shadows seemed to deepen, to coalesce into vaguely humanoid shapes that writhed just at the periphery of his vision. He squeezed his eyes shut for a brief moment, trying to banish the encroaching madness, but the image of the doll's unfolding hand was seared into his mind. When he opened them again, the doll's hand was still moving, and now he could hear it. A faint, dry whisper, like sand sifting through an hourglass, seemed to emanate from the doll's painted lips, a sound that chilled him to the very marrow of his bones. It was a language he didn't understand, but he felt its meaning, a promise of something inevitable, something terrible. The whisper, a dry, sifting sound like ancient dust disturbed, continued to emanate from the doll's painted mouth. Arlo strained to decipher its meaning, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. The sounds were alien, guttural, yet with a strange, almost musical cadence that was deeply unsettling. It spoke of emptiness, of a profound and ancient hunger, of things that had long been forgotten, buried beneath layers of time and neglect. He could feel the words, or rather the twined behind them, seeping into his consciousness, a subtle poison that eroded his resolve. Bartholomew, sensing Arlo's growing distress, squirmed violently in his arms, his claws digging into Arlo's jacket. The cat's fear was a tangible force, a mirror to Arlo's own spiraling dread. He risked a glance at the doll. Its hand, with those impossibly delicate, brittle fingers, was now fully extended, reaching towards him, a silent, beckoning gesture. The painted smile seemed to widen, splitting the porcelain face in a way that defied physics, a horrifying grin that promised a reunion with something unspeakable. Arlo's vision began to blur at the edges, the familiar contours of his living room warping and twisting. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to stretch and writhe, taking on shapes that flickered just beyond his direct gaze. He could almost feel them, cold tendrils reaching out, seeking to entwine him, to pull him into their suffocating embrace. The metallic tang in the air intensified, sharp and coppery, like the taste of blood. He imagined it was his own blood, seeping from unseen wounds, a physical manifestation of the damage this entity was inflicting. He felt a desperate urge to scream, to shatter the oppressive silence with a sound of his own, but his throat felt constricted, choked by an invisible hand. The doll's whisper grew louder, more insistent, its alien syllables weaving a tapestry of dread around him. He felt a strange detachment, a terrifying clarity that allowed him to observe his own unraveling with a chilling objectivity. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement in the doll's other hand, the one not outstretched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The tiny fingers of its left hand were beginning to move, mirroring the slow, deliberate unfolding of its right. A new sound joined the whispering, a faint rhythmic clicking, like tiny bones being meticulously rearranged. Arlo's breath hitched. The doll was not just reaching, it was preparing. Preparing for what? He didn't dare to imagine. But he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that this was not a game. This was an invitation, an enticement into a reality far more terrifying than his own fractured mind could conjure. He tightened his grip on Bartholomew, his knuckles white, and braced himself, a solitary figure against the encroaching darkness, the whispering doll his only horrifying companion. The clicking of tiny bones, a dry, sharp sound like twigs snapping underfoot, joined the doll's sifting whisper. Arlo's world, already a fractured mosaic of paranoia and fear, began to splinter further. He watched, a horrified spectator in his own life, as the doll's left hand meticulously rearranged itself. The fingers, each one a miniature marvel of brittle porcelain, seemed to shift and realign, the joints emitting soft, disconcerting pops. It was as if the doll were performing a silent, macabre surgery on itself, preparing for some unspeakable purpose. Bartholomew, his fur still bristling, let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of pure primal terror that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Arlo felt a desperate urge to protect his cat, to shield him from this encroaching horror, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if they were no longer his own. The metallic tang in the air was now overpowering, the coppery scent so strong he could almost taste it on his tongue. It was the taste of fear, he realized, the taste of his own fear made manifest. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, to grow and recede with an unnatural rhythm, as if breathing in time with the doll's unsettling whispers. He could feel a coldness seeping from the doll, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the void it represented. It was the chill of forgotten things, of things that should have remained buried, of a darkness that had been disturbed and was now seeking to reclaim what it felt was its due. He saw it then, a subtle shift in the doll's posture, a minuscule straightening of its spine. It was as if it were drawing itself up, preparing to rise, to step down from the armchair and onto the floor, onto the path towards him. Arlo's mind, a frantic, fragmented landscape, struggled to process the enormity of what was happening. This wasn't just a hallucination, it was a tangible manifestation of his deepest fears, a physical embodiment of the paranoia that had consumed him. The doll's whispers grew louder, the alien syllables weaving a complex tapestry of dread, and with each click of its rearranging bones, Arlo felt a piece of himself being chipped away. He was losing himself, his grip on reality, slipping with terrifying speed. He looked down at Bartholomew, the cat's amber eyes wide with a shared terror, and in that moment Arlo knew he had to act. He couldn't let this thing consume them both. He had to fight back, even if it meant facing the very source of his unraveling. He tightened his hold on Bartholomew, his gaze fixed on the doll, and braced himself for whatever unspeakable act it intended to perform. The doll's spine straightened with a series of soft, sickening cracks, a sound like dry branches breaking underfoot. Arlo flinched, his own back arching involuntarily as if in sympathetic pain. Bartholomew let out a low, choked yowl, his body rigid against Arlo's chest. The doll's painted smile seemed to stretch further, the cracked porcelain contorting into an impossible rictus of delight. Its outstretched hand, now fully formed and unnervingly precise, trembled slightly as if gathering an unseen energy. The whispers, no longer a mere sifting sound, now pulsed with a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to burrow into Arlo's very core. He felt a strange, disorienting shift in his perception, as if the very air around the doll had begun to shimmer, to distort. The metallic tang in the air intensified, sharp and almost painful, and Arlo could swear he tasted the phantom taste of rust on his tongue. He squeezed his eyes shut, a desperate, futile attempt to block out the encroaching horror. When he opened them again, the doll was no longer on the armchair. It was on the floor, standing, its tiny porcelain feet planted firmly on the worn rug. It was unnervingly tall now, its height seeming to fluctuate, to stretch and contract like a disturbing illusion. Its head was tilted, the vacant socket fixed on Arlo, and he felt a dizzying sense of being both observed and consumed. The room itself seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, the shadows coalescing into indistinct, writhing forms that danced just at the edge of his vision. He could feel his own sanity fraying, the edges of his perception blurring into a chaotic, nightmarish landscape. The doll took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. Each step was accompanied by the dry, clicking sound of its bones rearranging, a relentless percussion that echoed the frantic beating of Arlo's own heart. Bartholomew let out a piercing yowl, a sound of pure terror, and Arlo felt the cat struggle free from his weakened grip. He watched, helpless, as Bartholomew bolted, a streak of black fur disappearing into the kitchen, the sound of his frantic scrabbling fading into the oppressive silence. Arlo was alone again, facing the doll. It was closer now, its painted smile a terrifying beacon in the deepening gloom. He could feel its presence radiating outwards, a palpable wave of cold, malevolent energy. He raised his hands, not in defense, but in a gesture of surrender, his mind a chaotic storm of fragmented thoughts and overwhelming dread. The doll's whispers intensified, weaving a complex, alien tapestry of despair, and Arlo knew, with a chilling certainty, that the final act was about to begin. The doll, now a looming, distorted figure, took another step, its brittle feet clicking on the floorboards. Arlo could feel the pressure building, an invisible force pressing in on him, threatening to crush him. The metallic tang in the air was so strong now, he could taste the coppery essence of fear, of blood, of something ancient and putrid. The shadows in the room writhed with a life of their own, coalescing into fleeting shapes that seemed to whisper his name. He closed his eyes, a final, desperate act of defiance against the encroaching madness. He could hear the doll's whispers, a dry sifting sound like sand in an hourglass, and the clicking of its bones, a relentless percussion that echoed the frantic pounding in his chest. He felt a strange sense of peace, a terrifying surrender to the inevitable. When he opened his eyes, the doll was directly in front of him, its painted smile splitting its porcelain face in a grotesque rictus. Its outstretched hand, impossibly delicate and terrifyingly real, reached towards him. He could see the fine cracks in its porcelain skin, the almost imperceptible tremor in its tiny jointed fingers. He felt a cold dread wash over him, a recognition of something he had seen before, in the deepest, darkest corners of his own fractured mind. The doll's whisper intensified, no longer a sound but a vibration, a resonance that seemed to shake him to his very core. He felt his consciousness begin to fray, the edges of his reality blurring and dissolving. He could feel a pulling sensation, a gentle yet irresistible tug, drawing him towards the doll, towards the void that lay behind its vacant gaze. He saw Bartholomew then, a dark blur of fur darting from the kitchen, his amber eyes wide with a terror that mirrored Arlo's own. The cat let out a piercing yowl, a desperate cry of warning, but it was too late. Arlo felt a final sickening lurch, a sensation of being stretched, contorted, and then nothing. The whispers ceased. The clicking stopped, the metallic tang faded, the shadows receded. Arlo Hoffman was no more. Only the doll remained, perched on the edge of the armchair, its painted smile fixed, its vacant socket staring blankly ahead, a silent testament to the fragile boundary between sanity and the abyss.